Hello there, I'm Kirk, and today I wanted to share my experiences of watching Dune Part 2 in 3 different formats in theaters. Now, I did a video similarly to my experiences watching Oppenheimer last year, and I wanted to share my similar thoughts of how I saw Dune Part 2, as I was in the incredibly lucky opportunity to be able to watch it in 3 very different formats, one of those being an extremely rare one at IMAX Melbourne. So the 3 formats I was able to watch Dune Part 2 in that exact order was Dune in 1570mm IMAX film, Dune in IMAX 1:43:1 digital, as well as your standard digital experience. Now I'm going to share my experiences of watching the film in those 3 experiences, starting off with the first session that I watched on opening night, and that was Dune Part 2 in IMAX 1570mm film at IMAX Melbourne. If you did get a chance to see my previous IMAX related video for Dune Part 2, you would have seen that I had the opportunity to go behind the scenes at IMAX Melbourne to see one of only 12 IMAX 1570 prints, which is incredibly amazing that this film was actually distributed in that format, as weeks before the movie was actually going to be released, not even IMAX knew that was going to be a thing. So I was incredibly excited to watch Dune Part 2 at IMAX Melbourne in that format. Now, going to the opening session night, it was an absolutely packed theater. It was an incredible experience as per usual. Some might argue that watching this movie, Dune, directed by Denis Villeneuve, was actually a more worthy experience of the IMAX format, given the large screen and the large scale of Dune versus Oppenheimer. But to me, I think both of them have those merits in actually being able to watch and experience those films in a large format theater like IMAX. But what was the key difference for me watching Dune Part 2 in IMAX versus Oppenheimer in the film versions was the real and sheer fact that Dune was filmed digitally and then scanned into 1570 versus Oppenheimer that was shot in film and then projected in film as well. Now, the 1:43:1 aspect ratio screen was filled in both scenarios. I must say that when I was watching Dune Part 2 and having a very vivid memory of what Oppenheimer looked like on that IMAX screen projected by film, there was definitely a noticeable resolution difference between the two. Now, this is quite clear to me because Oppenheimer was shot on 1570 film and then projected in 1570 film, as well as the other film formats throughout the entire movie, versus Dune, which was shot digitally and then transferred onto film and then projected. So you are getting the qualities that you would get for film emulation in terms of grain, halation, and highlight roll-off and softness and everything, but you don't get the relative resolution that 1570 IMAX film has been quoted to have of up to 16 and 18K. So despite what other videos might say out there, Dune was definitely noticeably lower in terms of resolution when watching it on the large IMAX screen, but don't get me wrong, it was still an incredible experience being able to watch it in 1570. I noticed the gate weave was a little bit noticeable compared to the digital, which I'll get to in just a moment, but the sheer scale and size, and also hearing the slight little buzz of the projector in the back, is also a nice experience. But overall, the 1570 IMAX film was definitely something worthwhile actually being able to go and see and actually be able to experience, considering there was only one of 12 prints in the world. But noticeably, because the source material was not shot on that format, the quality differences between the 4K and the film prints, or the film print versus the 4K projection, which I'll get to right now, was noticeably less versus when I watched Oppenheimer in 1570 versus Dune. But those massive sandworms, the awesome battle sequences, and even the really intimate moments projected in 1:43:1 was really spectacular, and I loved it. Next up, after watching Dune in 1570mm film, I then saw it a couple of days later in the same 1:43:1 IMAX Melbourne theater in digital, and I have to say, this is really the Goldilocks experience for me, and controversially maybe, was probably my favorite experience of the 3 so far. I felt that the IMAX 4K digital laser projection system compared to the film print was a little bit more contrasty. I noticed that with the digital sound, although I might be a little bit wrong here, I felt was far more impactful versus the film print version that I did see. Now, I am someone that is a massive advocate for watching movies on film. I think it's always a special experience, and I definitely enjoyed Oppenheimer a lot more watching that movie on film. But the digital experience to me, especially those open gate sequences when they utilize the full sensor of the RE cameras to showcase again those big and intimate moments of the movie, was absolutely jaw-dropping to watch. I was in my most preferred seat around about at the middle up the back, and I think that's the best seat in IMAX. And although a lot of the seats around the middle center of the theater are also great, Watching it in digital up the back was a great spot to be, and I really recommend, if you have any opportunity, to go and try and find a true IMAX projected experience. So that means a 1:43:1 theater, not the LIMAX alternative people like to say, where they market a cinema screen of just having an expanded 16:9 aspect ratio. It definitely makes a big difference, as that's really where they intended for people to watch it, in the best format. That's how a lot of the shots were composed in the end. So I guess all in all, what I'm saying is that if you weren't in the lucky position to be able to see Dune Part 2 in film, don't stress too much. I've definitely found that there were some slight noticeable film emulation differences compared to watching it on digital, which for better or worse may have been good or bad depending on what your opinion might be. The differences between Oppenheimer on film versus Oppenheimer on digital were far greater compared to Dune Part 2 on digital versus film, and that just comes back to the nature that the Dune film was shot on digital in the end. But where the big difference slide compared to everything, and is really a testament to the IMAX 4K digital projectors, was when I watched Dune Part 2 on a standard digital projection system. And locally here in Australia, we have Hoyts Theatres, which is one of the main cinema chains that market their big and best theaters as extreme screen. And when going into the theater, the ad started to play and it looked like a nice big 16:9 screen, but in reality, I think when the curtains kind of pulled back, it was just your standard 239 screen, but marketed as extreme screen, being just their biggest theaters in general. And I have to say, IMAX definitely ruins this experience for you. Once you've watched a film, or particularly Dune, in IMAX that's been formatted that way and shot in those big sequences, it completely is ruined. It completely ruins the experience when you go to a digital projection system like Hoyts, in my personal opinion. And that's for two reasons. Number one, the aspect ratio obviously doesn't go beyond 239:1, and honestly, that's not a huge problem for me. But the bigger problem being number two is that the quality of the projection I find to be far inferior compared to the IMAX 4K laser projectors, and that comes down from a contrast perspective, a brightness perspective, but also I found, because Dune is quite a contrasty film in terms of you have really dark sequences, and then the filmmakers have decided to quickly cut to these bright desert landscapes to make your irises open up, or the aperture in your eyes open up to really feel like you're in the desert. I feel like the projection system kind of struggled with those differences, because I noticed when you saw a lot of people walking off in the distance in the Hoyts extreme screen experience, or whatever you want to call it, there was a lot of chromatic aberration outlining the people in on the screen. For example, I know when like Zendaya's character and Timothée Chalamet's character Paul Atreides and Chani were walking off on the top of the sand dunes, having their little conversations at all, I could see these green and purple outlines around them, which was really not an amazing experience. And that theater does have Dolby Atmos, and I have to admit, amazing sound, but once again, doesn't compare to what you experience in an IMAX theater, or at least at IMAX Melbourne. In the end, for some people, an IMAX experience may be too much. The screen might be too big. It might be too many, sensory overload. But for me, I do enjoy actually watching a theater in the best way and biggest way possible, especially when it's a big open landscape one like Dune. And the differences I found were immediately noticeable when I was watching Dune Part 2 at Hoyts, was when that opening scene when the Harkonnens are scaling the Arrakis cliff in the beautifully orange lit landscapes, when they started to just ascend up the mountain, there was no sense of scale. There was the screen was a lot smaller. You couldn't actually look up and see how big the cliff face was and how awesome the cable effects were of all of the people flying up. And immediately as that scene opened up and I was watching Dune for the third time, I knew that this was not going to rival or come anywhere close to the IMAX experience. So that wraps up my 3 experiences. I'm really curious to hear how you watch Dune Part 2 around the world. It's always fascinating to hear other people's experiences and opinions, because in the end, I'm not right or wrong with anything I've said. It's all my opinion and my experience in the theaters, and I'm really keen to hear yours. But if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know in the comment section below, and I'm keen to hear your thoughts. But in the meantime, have a wonderful day, stay safe, and of course, do take care.